Hey everyone, it's Mr. A, back with another video. Today we're going to tackle a new project on the Pottery Wheel. This is called Wheel Throwing a Cylinder the Mr. A Way. Now obviously we're going to start with a big chunk of clay, but make sure it's something you can handle, something you can fit into the palm of your hands. You can smash it into a ball. Now one thing to keep in mind is please don't try to fold the clay over onto itself to make that ball. So you'll notice that I'm actually kind of rolling it while pressing in on the sides. It's really important not to trap any air bubbles that you've already gotten out. You'll notice that I'm placing it right in the center, and this is the most important part. Centering the clay relates to every form of success when it comes to pottery. Before turning on the wheel, we're going to use pressure with a cupping motion to almost seal it to the wheel. Notice I'm turning while pressing down, keeping it exactly centered. The more centered I can keep the clay throughout the throwing process, the more confident I can be in the result that I'm going to get on the wheel. The last step before we turn the power on is to make sure we create a clean seal of the ball to the wheel. With the downward sweeping motion of my thumb, I can guarantee the clay isn't going to come off when we start spinning this thing. But be sure to go all the way around and make sure not to throw out any of that centering we've already done. As I turn on the power, I can hold my finger, bracing my elbow on my legs to make sure that I can trim up any extra stuff that I don't want there, so I'll keep a nice centered mass. If it helps, you might want to consider using a rib tool or another flat object to do the same thing. Keep in mind, we're doing this to make the centering process easier. We don't want to do any heavy lifting once the power is on. We're just trimming out any uneven spots to make this job easier for us in the long run. Now this is where the magic starts happening. I'm going to be transferring some water using a sponge. Now there's a lot of force spinning around here, and the last thing I want is the clay to stick to my fingers in order to pull that thing apart. Notice I'm using a cupping motion with both hands to create what I call the bubble muffin. These rounded edges are really nice to see if I'm getting along towards center. Check for that wobble. The next step is to karate chop the cake. Now notice how I have flat pressure and round pressure. With my right hand on top, I keep the base of my hand there to flatten out the top, creating a cake-like shape. I'm going to take the time to take an overhead view of my cake. I'm going to inspect it for any wobble. If you can compare the edges of the cake with the spinning wheel, you might see a wobble. If you don't, like I don't at this point, I know that the cake is centered. With everything centered, it's now time to mark the center ring. Using a needle tool, what I'm going to do is keep it in one spot and slowly lower it onto the top of the cake. When the wheel is spinning, that's going to create a perfect ring where I know where to drop my finger in order to create the center hole of the pot. Be sure to start off by adding some water. When you drop the hole, you want to make sure to brace as much as possible. I use my elbows braced on my legs, and I also grab my other hand to support it so it doesn't shake while pressing down gently down through the ring that we just created. After we have a small divot, we're going to add a little more water and proceed. Be careful not to go all the way through and touch the wheel. To check to see how far my finger's gone, I can kind of hold my finger and create a cross brace to see how far I've actually gone. Now without going all the way through, I know that I'm safe to start creating the donut. Now creating a hook with my finger and making sure there's plenty of water in the hole, I can slowly start to add pressure by pulling out. What I'm doing is spreading the bottom, so I'll have a flat bottom to my pot. I'm also making sure that the walls don't tear out too quickly. We want them to be thick, secure, and using the hook of my finger, I can press them down, compacting them. When you're working on the pottery wheel, it's important to compress and clean the clay. Anything in pottery, water is a double-edged sword. Water can help us keep our hands clean of the clay. It can help us give a smooth action, but it can also create muddy clay that will collapse on the wheel. After using my sponge to dry off all surfaces of the clay and smooth it out, we're ready for our first pull. I'm going to drip some water along the edge and use my 2 fingers like a claw, putting the sponge in between, but using that on the outside. I'm going to slip to the bottom of the pot, and I'm going to add slight pressure like my claw, and I'm going to carefully brace on my knees and pull upward in a smooth motion. Now, if my fingers are sticking to the wall of the pot, that means I need some more water. I'm going to gently do it again. We're going to pull some of that clay up. You can see the ring traveling up. If I pinch too hard, I'll tear the walls. If I don't pinch hard enough, I won't get some clay in that ring. So it's a balancing act. Take it slow. We'd rather do a slow pull than a fast one. If you see water gathering up in the bottom, I'm going to dry that out, taking care not to bump the sides. The sponge is a great storage tool for water, but it's also great for drying things out. Use your judgment. If the walls are too slimy, make sure to dry them out periodically. As you get better at this, you should be able to complete the full amount of pulling in about 4 to 5 passes. We don't want this clay to start to sag. We don't want to add too much water because as it gets taller, we don't want the weight from the top to be too much for the bottom to handle. So be careful of storing any water in the bottom for too long. I'm always drying out that base, compressing it to make sure that it's going to be a solid piece to dry out. Moving on, let's check out to see if it's still centered. If there's minimal wobble, that means that we've stayed steady whenever we're doing our pulls. There is a chance if I move too quickly that I could throw it out of balance and eliminate all that hard work I've done. From the side, you can see that there's a little bit of wobble from the top. So using a needle tool, similarly from dropping the center hole, we can hold it in one spot, trim off the top, and create a uniform height for our pot. This is natural. Trimming is a great way to finish up any irregularities in your pot. Now all we have left to do is just some trimming and finishing of the surfaces of our pot. So using the sponge as a dryer, I can actually round out and smooth out any irregularities that you might still see from trimming. Don't be afraid to lightly compress the top edges and make sure that there's no burrs or small pieces of clay hanging off. On the inside, I'm going to take one last look at the bottom, make sure I flatten it out and compress it. I'll take one more swipe along the edge to clean it up with the sponge. And notice that I'm trying to eliminate any excess water to try to dry this out. Using a needle tool, I'm going to be putting a foot on this piece. I'm putting it at a 45-degree angle and I'm cutting through while it's spinning till I hit the base of the wheel. I'm then going to insert it and cut through that ring that I've created and then slowly turn on the wheel, and that will undercut this little ring that I've created. Now, after I do a full rotation, I'm then going to use the needle tool to pull away what I can of that excess clay. Now, instead of having that ramp on the side of your pot, you're going to have a nice, clean cutaway. Using your finger or a rib tool or something else that has a flat surface, I can even this out some more. Adding slight pressure, notice how it turns into an almost perfect right angle at the base. This is what we want. Now, before we remove this from the wheel, I'm going to do some finishing techniques with the rib tool as well as a finishing rubber, or what I like to call the sweet potato chip tool. So using the flat edge of any surface, I can slowly work my way up, making sure not to go too quickly because I don't want to get a screw pattern that wraps around the piece. This flattening out not only compresses the clay particles to make it a nice strong wall, but it also gives it a nice finish so that when I put glaze on there, I'm not going to see the microscopic swirls that would have been put on either by my fingers or a sponge tool. Compressing the top again can give me a nice clean corner. It doesn't have to be a right angle. Depending on what this is used for, you may want to taper the edge if it's something like a mug. For this one, I'm going to stick with a 90-degree angle. The finishing rubber is a soft piece of rubber that has a nice clean edge. it's going to provide an even smoother look where I won't even see some of the clay burrs that a wooden rib tool would give me. It's important to keep the tool clean, however. This tool tends to work if your clay isn't that soggy or wet. So make sure that if yours is a little soggy, you could use something like a hair dryer to dry it out so you're getting a little closer to leather hard, and that will allow you to really polish up those edges with something like a finishing rubber. Alternatively, you could use a small piece of plexiglass. If the inside of your pot needs any cleaning, or that edge shows some evidence of burrs or small pieces of clay that need to be removed, this is a great time to take care of that. But if it looks good, we're going to move on to taking it off the pottery wheel. First, we're going to transfer some water to the base of the pot with a sponge. Using a scraper, I'm going to turn the wheel on and slowly edge towards the center by undercutting the pot. As it gets closer to the center, we're going to want to slow it down. Once we feel it break free, we're going to slide it slowly towards the edge. I'm ready to use a bat or a board to transport the pot. I don't want to put it into my hand. I want a flat surface I can transfer it on. Make sure if it's heavy to hold on tight. I'm sliding it on, using the scraper to transfer all the weight onto it. I can slightly push it with my thumb if I need to get it off, and then I'm going to transfer it to a storage shelf where I can dry it to leather hard. Now before I put this away, I always like to clean up the wheel quickly. So what I do is if there's any excess clay, I like to scrape it off using a circular motion of the wheel. Then I use the sponge by applying some water, and then I don't even have to apply any major pressure, but I work from the outside in with a wet sponge so I can get all of the clay water off of the wheel. And then I empty out any of that dirty water, rinse out the sponge, and make it dry. And then I'm going to work from the center outwards, and then I can wipe down the entire wheel very quickly. If there's any clay scraps, especially stuff that we trimmed off, we want to make sure that those don't go in the sink. So be sure to either recycle that clay or throw it in the garbage if you're not going to reuse it. Now all that's left to do is let's find a safe place to start to dry this out to leather hard. I'm going to find a shelf and put a bucket over the top. That way it's going to ensure that it goes to leather hard until we have time to trim it and put a proper foot on the bottom. Now that just about does it. The cylinder is a basic form that can then be turned into pretty much any other type of shape. But if you enjoyed this video, stay tuned and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification button for more videos as they come out. See you next time on Art with Mr. A.